challenge we had was collecting for assurance of learning that we had to address the program learning objective group communication. Previously, we hadn't collected on this program learning objective, so we had to find an effective way to do it. The difficulty was that assurance of learning has to be collected on an individual task, and yet we were dealing with group communication. So what I did was, I went through and identified the courses that actually had group tasks in them. Now, for assurance of learning, we're supposed to collect a minimum of 20% for on the assessment task. I felt this was too onerous for any one course to take, but I identified there were 4 courses, 2 courses in the marketing major and 2 courses in the entrepreneurship major that had group projects. So the way I approached it was, I thought it was a good idea that if each of those courses took 10% and put it towards group communication, that we would have then 20% for the marketing major and 20% for the entrepreneurship major. Now, to approach this, because these conveners weren't particularly, they weren't aware of how to go through this process, of how to collect this data with a group project. So I thought, well, the first thing I would do is I would go in and look at the rubric, the group communication rubric. And normally, the criteria dealt with conflict, teamwork, that type of thing. So I took that rubric and I thought, now how could each of these tasks apply this rubric? So before I spoke to the conveners, and they were aware that they had to collect this data, and I had told them they would have to take 10% and allocate it towards this particular task, and I told them the best way to do it would be through a critical reflection. So I took the rubric and I sort of got 5 criteria that I thought really addressed all those issues around group communication. I then formulated a sort of a draft rubric, a template that I could then present to the conveners. I then met with the 4 conveners, we discussed the rubric, and I said that this is the way you will approach the task. So all the students will do the group task, and then after it, they will do this critical reflection on how they addressed all these areas within that task. Critical reflection was really the only way we could do this. I also suggested, try again to make it easier for the conveners, that we could take that rubric and they could contextualise it for their own specific instance. So if it was for market research, they would sort of relate the context to market research. But I stipulated I didn't want them to change the rubric to any great extent. I wanted them to keep within those set criteria. Because this way we'd be collecting data across these 4 courses. And I felt that was going to be quite meaningful. Again, to simplify the process, I suggested they would take the rubric, and based on that, they would come up with a template of a Word document that each of those 5 criteria would be turned into statements, and the students could address each of those statements when they did the critical reflection. The other thing is too about assurance of learning, that it's not just about the assessment task, it's about the teaching and learning activities that scaffold that assessment task. So I believed it was really important when we've got students doing a lot of group projects that it's important that the convener really emphasises and works through activities and discusses, well, what is it about group communication? How do you address those areas of conflict and teamwork? And the beauty of assurance of learning, it's a way of identifying the gaps we have in our teaching in terms of those teaching and learning activities. So that was the way I approached it. I felt in my role as Director of Learning and Teaching, that if I gave each of these conveners a foundation to work with, it would make that process simpler for them. One of the things too, at this point, I'm not talking about the outcomes. As I said, there tends to be quite a bit of resistance from conveners in terms of when they're placed in a position, when they're told they've got to collect data for something like group communication. But I felt that in my role, just to have these conversations with them, to actually provide them with that initial template and direction, I thought that would really help them. And then I said to the 4 of them, I said, now you go away and you have those discussions, and then you four come up with, you agree in terms of the direction that you want to take. So again, it will take some time to sort of evaluate how effective this has been, but with assurance of learning, because we have to collect on individually, on each individual student, we have to find effective ways of doing this. And as I said, group tasks, they're not, we do them at university, but they're also incredibly important because they're authentic. They reflect what will happen in the workplace. And it's so important that as teachers that we, that we find ways to sort of mirror a lot of those things that will happen in the workplace, that we can say, well, what do you do in this situation? How do you work through these issues? How do you organise teamwork? How do you, separate those roles? How do you deal with conflict? And if we're not teaching these things to students, then I believe we're doing them a disservice. My advice for anybody else, sort of dealing with this problem, would be, again, have conversations. Talk to people. Everybody can bring their own skills to this, this process. My skills, I suppose, was that I like talking to people. I'm fairly good with developing rubrics, but I didn't necessarily know about their own particular context. All I was doing was providing them a framework. And I think it's so important that we do take a team approach, whether it be in our departments or more broadly across the university. We don't need to keep reinventing something. We need to look out to see what is already there, what resources are there to support us. And the other thing is too, I think very much as a program director, I have a program level view of everything. So I see how those courses and all those assessment tasks fits within the program and the program learning goals, more so than just the objectives. And I want to make sure that everything is very well integrated, both vertically and horizontally.